Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Handmaker, and I am Associate Professor in Legal Sociology here at the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And before I start, I would like to invite those of us who are joining us online through the live feed. If you are a faculty member or a student at Erasmus University Rotterdam, you can log in using your ERNA account. If that doesn't succeed, or if you're not part of Erasmus University Rotterdam, you can pose your questions to the email, which is on that screen. It's Dutch Scholars for Palestine @gmail.com. Okay? So, welcome. I just want to say a few things in advance of this event, because there's been a lot of discussion around whether even these events should be held, not to mention what actually is being discussed. So at Erasmus University Rotterdam, we believe very strongly in academic freedom and in free speech. Freedoms that, as the past few weeks have demonstrated, we most certainly cannot take for granted. Moreover, at ISS, we feel strongly that universities should be a welcoming place where sensitive topics can be discussed. This particular topic around apartheid in Israel does make people feel profoundly uncomfortable. In fact, that is a perfectly normal response. Who would feel comfortable talking about apartheid? At ISS, we are well acquainted with this topic of apartheid, having for decades organized events about it. From the 1960s, certainly from the massacres that took place in South Africa then, especially, but also before. These discussions concerned apartheid in South Africa, and for the past 12 years in particular, but also before, apartheid in Israel and Palestine. Being uncomfortable is not the same as feeling unsafe. Nevertheless, we must always be mindful of how we address ourselves to each other. Hence, ensuring a safe space for such discussions means that, actually, two very simple things. We do not tolerate any form of sexism, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, or any other form of discriminatory or hate speech. Moreover, no ad hominem attacks are allowed against individual speakers, which is basically where you attack somebody as an individual because of their individual views. You can obviously critically engage with them, and that's what we hope you will do. So in our long experience organizing events on the topic of apartheid, whether in South Africa or in Palestine, you're dealing with two impasses. First of all, and these impasses concern land and nationality. So from 1917 until the present, and especially since 1967, Israel has systematically acquired more and more land from Palestinians, rendering a two-state solution impossible. Contestations around land have been fierce. These contestations have often been violent, leading to violent conflict and resulting in millions of Palestinians having lost their land and livelihoods, becoming forcibly displaced. Families have been separated across many different places of exile. According to the 2016-2018 survey by the Palestinian NGO Badil, Palestinian refugees number approximately 7.94 million Palestinian refugees. This comprises 8 million people, the largest forcibly displaced population on Earth, including around 760,000 internally displaced persons, Palestinians who remained within the borders of what is now referred to as Israel, residing inside the areas in blue on the map you saw before, the remainder in exile, especially in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And the second part of the impasse, there's a lot you can say here, but these two things I think are really important to understand. So the consequences of Israel's regime of apartheid, which you will hear more about from our distinguished speakers, have been especially acute for communities living in close proximity to each other, such as in Jerusalem and in Hebron, as you see in the picture in front of you. They are forced to live in separate areas on the basis of nationality. The impasse over nationality is essentially about which nationality is protected and which nationality isn't. So together, this is what several Palestinian organizations, including Al-Haq, Israeli organizations B'Tselem, Adalah, United Nations experts and scholars, including Professor John Dugard, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International, had described as a situation of apartheid, with specific legal, demographic, political, economic, and sociological dimensions. So, that by way of introduction, I would now like to introduce our distinguished speakers, both here in person, mostly here in person, which is actually quite wonderful, I have to say. This is the first sort of significant event we've had since the regulations were relaxed. So it's really very special to see all of you here for all kinds of different reasons. So to briefly introduce our panelists of today, and I'm going to say a bit more about each of them later, we are joined by Omar Barghouti, who's a keynote speaker, Saleh Hijazi from Amnesty International, Jaap Hamburger from A Different Jewish Voice, Dana Abueda from Free Palestine Maastricht, and Fatima Faid from the Haagse Stadspartij. So, first speaker is our keynote speaker, Omar Barghouti. Omar Barghouti is a former research fellow here at the International Institute of Social Studies, a position he held for 2 years. He's a Palestinian scholar and a human rights defender. Among many awards, he's co-recipient of the 2017 Ghandi Peace Award, which was presented to him at Yale University in the United States. He co-founded the Palestinian-led Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, or BDS movement, and he's currently pursuing a PhD in philosophy with an emphasis on ethics at the University of Amsterdam. The title of his keynote address is Complicity, Duplicity, and Fractured Humanity of the West, Palestine as a Litmus Test. Omar Barghouti, you're very welcome. Please give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me well? Okay, good. From Dostoevsky to Tchaikovsky, and from Russian patients to Russian cats, the Wild West is possessed by a xenophobic mob mentality, boycotting everyone and everything Russian, or even remotely associated with Russia. BBC and CNN are broadcasting tutorials on how best to make and use Molotov cocktails. You know something is wrong when they do that. A beacon of Western reason, the University of Florida renamed its Karl Marx study room as retribution to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. White people have gone crazy, again. And that's a very scary thing for humanity, as history shows. A European colleague recently asked me if we can demonize and ostracize blonde, lily-white Russians like this, imagine what we would do if the enemy were not so white. So I told her, we don't have to imagine. For 500 years, we've been experiencing various degrees of a much worse, unbridled white violence, animated by racial stratification and dehumanization that have placed us on what Charles Mills calls a lower ontological and moral rung. Putting Western hypocrisy aside for the moment, what does all this have to do with Palestine? Professor John Dugard, whom Jeff mentioned, prominent South African jurist, former judge ad hoc of the International Court of Justice here in The Hague, once wrote, quote, "The issue of Palestine has become the litmus test for human rights. If the West fails to show concern for Palestinian human rights, the non-Western rest of the world will conclude that human rights is a tool employed by the West against regimes it dislikes and not an objective and universal instrument for the measurement and the treatment of people throughout the world." But why? The imperialist West is implicated in a myriad of racial, economic, social, and climate injustices worldwide, and relatively speaking, the question of Palestine remains quite tiny in comparison to all this. But what Dugard is really referring to is not related to the number of Palestinians living under Israel's regime of military occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid, but he's referring to the unparalleled complicity of the West in supporting this regime, funding it, arming it, shielding it from accountability to international law. After South African apartheid was defeated, Israel remains the most resisted European settler colony, one that is crucially implanted in the heart of the smeared, feared, desired, contested, and detested Orient. But the West is not monolithic, of course. The outpouring of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle following Israel's televised massacre in Gaza and atrocities in Jerusalem and across historic Palestine last summer has been unprecedented. Solidarity from mass social and racial justice movements, including the Movement for Black Lives and the Sunrise Movement in the US, was echoed by major TV network personalities, music icons, star athletes, Hollywood celebrities. Dock workers' unions in Oakland, California, Durban, South Africa, and across Italy have refused or started to organize towards refusing handling Israeli goods. A YouGov poll last year revealed how sharply Israel's favorability has dropped among European publics, including in France, the UK, and Germany. This significant shift in supporting Palestinian rights is due to several factors. Prominent among them, the increasing consensus that Israel is an apartheid state, and the tireless work of the Palestinian-led Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, supported by millions globally, in planting seeds of meaningful solidarity and nourishing them over the years. Recognizing this unmistakable shift, the Israeli foreign minister earlier this year said, quote, "Calling Israel an apartheid state was a slowly creeping trend for a very long time, and in 2022, it will be a real threat," end of quote. He's right. Indeed, Israel has been designated as an apartheid state, as Jeff mentioned, by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, not to mention Palestinian, South African, and international human rights advocates. UN Special Rapporteur Michael Link, just a couple of days ago, designated Israel as perpetrating the crime of apartheid, at least in the occupied Palestinian territory. Even a former Israeli Attorney General wrote, quote, "You simply cannot be a liberal democracy if you operate apartheid over another people. It is a contradiction in terms because Israel's entire society is complicit in this unjust reality," end of quote. Largely blaming BDS for this growing recognition of Israeli apartheid, earlier this year, the far-right Israeli government approved allocating additional resources for fighting BDS. Israel's war on BDS has included, in addition to heightened propaganda, legal warfare or lawfare, and the use of its powerful intelligence services to spy on the movement and its networks and to try to sabotage them. That's their term. Inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement and the US civil rights movement, BDS is rooted in a long heritage of Palestinian popular nonviolent resistance. It was launched in 2005 by the broadest coalition in Palestinian society, calling for ending the 1967 occupation, upholding the right of Palestinian refugees to return, and ending Israel's institutionalized and legalized system of racial domination, which meets the UN definition of apartheid. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, BDS has consistently and categorically opposed all forms of racism and discrimination, including anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism, sexism, homo and transphobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. Identity should never diminish or restrict one's entitlement to rights, we believe. Our movement, therefore, targets complicity, not identity. The BDS movement belongs to the intersectional progressive wave that believes in the indivisibility of justice, as Angela Davis puts it. It joins indigenous, racial, economic, gender, LGBTQI+, climate, and social justice struggles in the fight against the forces of fascism, racism, patriarchy, and neoliberalism. Underlining this intersectionality, US Congresswoman Cori Bush said, quote, "The fight for Black lives and the fight for Palestinian liberation are interconnected. We oppose our money going to fund militarized policing, occupation, and systems of violent oppression and trauma. We are anti-apartheid, period." End of quote. While a growing number of anti-colonial Jewish Israeli BDS supporters play a significant role in the movement, a recent poll shows, shocking poll, shows that 16% of all Jewish Americans support BDS. 16%, 1 out of every 6. They understand that there is nothing Jewish about Israel's siege, ethnic cleansing, massacres, land theft, and apartheid. And therefore, there's nothing anti-Jewish per se in supporting BDS to end these crimes. As tens of progressive Jewish organizations have said, conflating opposition to Israel's regime of oppression and its ideology, Zionism, on the one hand, with anti-Jewish hatred, discrimination, and racism on the other, is an attempt to distort the very definition of anti-Semitism and to weaponize it to simultaneously silence advocacy of Palestinian rights and provide Israel with impunity for its crimes. This not only harms the Palestinian liberation struggle, those Jewish organizations have said, but also the struggle against real anti-Semitism. Above everything else, BDS calls for ending international, state, corporate, and institutional complicity in Israel's regime of military occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid, not just for Palestinians' sake, but for humanity's sake as well. Israel sells its military security technologies and colonial doctrines as battle-tested worldwide, tested, of course, primarily on Palestinians, whom it treats as an inferior racial group, as Amnesty International put it. For instance, Israel has used its weaponized spyware technologies like NSO's Pegasus as a diplomacy tool. Through those exports, Israel has for decades been a culprit in war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated by dictatorships, death squads, authoritarian regimes worldwide in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. Moreover, as the BDS movement has consistently warned for over 5 years now, the rising wave of Israeli-induced anti-Palestinian repression in the West, including in this country, which I've called McCarthyism 2.0, will not stop at suppressing freedom of expression on Palestine. We've been saying this for 5 years. If this repression succeeds, no other justice movement is safe. Your liberal rights, your civic rights are not safe. In fact, Israel's anti-BDS lawfare has already become a template, especially in the United States, and the US is always the testing ground for Europe, so it's coming here. It has already become a template in the US for repressing campaigns against fossil fuels and the powerful gun lobby, as well as campaigns for women's reproductive rights and black voters' rights. The same senators in those states that passed anti-BDS resolutions are passing those resolutions against all those other justice movements. Aside from progressives, every liberal should be concerned about this McCarthyism 2.0. Israel has waged this all-out war of repression against BDS also because the movement has drastically redefined solidarity with the Palestinian liberation struggle as an ethical obligation to end complicity, to do no harm, before every other form of solidarity. Few forms of solidarity have triggered as much alarm in apartheid Israel's establishment as the growing support for the academic and cultural boycott of complicit Israeli institutions. During the last year alone, tens of student governments and tens of thousands of academics worldwide have endorsed BDS measures. Hundreds of academic departments and programs have expressed solidarity with the Palestinian liberation struggle, with many in the Netherlands. A shout out here to Utrecht University's Gender Studies Department and of course the role ISS has played in this solidarity. The academic boycott is closely connected to Israel's relentless attack on Palestinian education, which some have termed scholasticide, going back to the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the Nakba. An Israeli researcher's dissertation, for instance, reveals that during and immediately after the Nakba, tens of thousands of books stolen from Palestinian homes, schools, and libraries were plundered and destroyed systematically by Zionist and later Israeli militias. In the first few weeks of the First Intifada, 1987 to 1993, Israel shut down all Palestinian universities, some like Birzeit University, for 4 consecutive years. And then Israel shut down all 1,194 Palestinian schools, followed by closing all kindergartens in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. This prompted Palestinians to build an illegal network of underground schools. Israeli universities have for decades played an indispensable role in planning, implementing, justifying, and whitewashing this entire regime of oppression against the Palestinians. It takes many forms, including the development of weapon systems and military doctrines used in the commission of Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity. Also, these universities systematically provide the military intelligence establishment with indispensable research from archaeology, demography, geography, hydrology, psychology, philosophy, among other disciplines. And they tolerate, even reward, racist speech and theories that dehumanize the indigenous Palestinians. This complicity also includes the illegal construction of campus facilities in the occupied Palestinian territory, as Hebrew University has done in East Jerusalem, for instance. The BDS movement, including the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACB, upholds the universal right to academic freedom, and therefore calls for boycotting institutions, not individuals. PACB rejects, on principle, any McCarthyite political tests or targeting individuals based on their identity or opinion. Ending Dutch and Western complicity in apartheid has become even more urgent in light of the West's reactions to Russia's invasion of Ukraine that I've mentioned earlier, and the hypocrisy that engulfs it. For the record, the BDS movement has publicly opposed this illegal invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as a violation of the UN Charter, regardless of persistent NATO provocations. The BDS movement has also condemned the patently illegal and immoral US or NATO-led wars of the past decades. Many Western and Western-dominated entities, including FIFA, OECD, hundreds of corporations, cultural, academic, and sports institutions, have imposed severe boycotts and sanctions on Russia and Russians in solidarity with Ukrainians. Yet they continue to be complicit in Israel's much longer system of occupation, illegal settlements, and grave violations of Palestinian rights. They always rhetorically rebuffed our demands, saying that business endeavors, the arts, academic pursuits, sports, or fill in the blanks are above politics. Suddenly, nothing is above politics. To end, when a reporter asked Gandhi what he thought of Western civilization, he famously replied, "I think it would be a good idea." Toni Morrison gives some insight into this. She says, quote, "Slavery broke Europe. It made them slave masters. It made them crazy." See, I'm not the only one who thinks so. You can't do that for hundreds of years and it not take a toll. They had to dehumanize not just the slaves, but themselves. End of quote. In the same vein, Aimé Césaire writes, quote, "No one colonizes innocently. A nation which colonizes, a civilization which justifies colonization, is already a sick civilization, a civilization that is morally diseased." To prove Césaire right, a few weeks ago, in the US, the crown jewel of European settler colonialism and modernity, the Senate, the US Senate, after a century, 100 years of failed attempts, finally passed a bill that would make lynching a federal hate crime. After 100 years of trying, they finally passed it weeks ago, explicitly criminalizing this heinous symbol of racial violence. Palestinians and many oppressed communities worldwide wonder, when will the West's lynching of the rest of humanity be finally criminalized and ended? Palestine may be too small to consider in this big picture, but it is increasingly recognized today in the global South and gradually among progressive grassroots groups in the global North too, as a critical symbol, a litmus test of sorts for whether the West can be decolonized, ending its duplicity, its complicity, and healing its fractured humanity. Thank you.